Welcome to the Occupational Safety Leadership Podcast, episode number 173 with Dr. Dan Snyder. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the intersection of occupational safety and ethics out there. Before we get started, Dan, could you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, and then we'll just dive right in.
Sure, sure. Well, I'm Dan Snyder, as you mentioned, and I'm just cycling off as director at large for the board of directors for the American Society of Safety Engineers. And I've been in the business for about 32 years. Most of my work's been in professional competencies, and many people know me from exam prep and preparing people to pass certifications exams, and been involved in a lot of different activities and operations for private and public industries over the years, and kind of collected quite a few different scenarios and war stories and things like we get when you gather these things as your career progresses. So I'm really in a point of more of mentoring. I help people with their dissertations and PhD work and academic work, and professor at the University of Central Missouri. So go Mules! I've got to give a plug to the safety sciences program there. And so I've been exploring ethics, which is our talk today, for, I don't know, maybe I guess we all explore ethics our whole life. It's really a journey of reflection. But as far as professional ethics and looking at really how does our profession, view ethics, and what are the different codes of conduct and codes of ethics that are in there, and did some comparison analysis there, and really try to develop, I think, some things that people might take away with better professionally on an understanding of ethics and how do you work through ethical dilemmas or decision making. And I think it is a conscious thought. I think it's something that we as safety professionals operate as moral agents. When you look at healthcare or any of that that could involve people, the harm of people or the good health and safety of people, that's where you tend to find these professions and the health professions, the Hippocratic Oath of doctors do no harm. And we have the same language within our codes of conduct and ethics. And so we do have people's lives to some degree within our influence, our sphere of influence. So with that forms a profession, and with a profession requires a code of ethics or code of conduct to be considered a profession. And really, it's just a group of like-minded individuals that are in a technical trade or what we might call a profession that apply skills, services within a really kind of scope of operation. And so we are really, in my opinion, a moral agent. And I think the ethics conversation is becoming more and more prevalent. And I think it's becoming a little deeper than what it may have had in the past of what people thought ethics was. So that's really been my kind of side experimentation, along with some other research that I've been playing around with, and I've done a few talks and a few seminars and workshops, and have really gotten some pretty good feedback from other fellow professionals about the way we're discussing ethics and the way we're maybe framing ethics differently than they thought in the past.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Um, I think I have really good ethics, but when I think about it, I'm not sure that I could really put a definition on it. Is there a is there a definition, or I should say a definition that you would use if there's not like a commonly accepted?
Sure, sure. There's several what we call valid moral positions. And so I might just start with kind of splicing morals and ethics a little bit. For all practical purposes, we're talking about the same thing. There really isn't any difference. Morals are really the why people do what they do, their moral values, what they feel is right versus wrong is a very simple thing. But then also context and circumstances to how they derive decisions goes into that context. So for some people, they may be grounded in religion context. Their moral fiber, their moral compass is very much rooted in their theology, their religion. Others might put that more into the ethics of people, like ethics of care, like you find in nursing, or some may just be just good person. What's it take to be a good character, a good person, and that gets into more Aristotle type ethics of things. And so there's a lot of different schools of thought around ethics. None are wrong. It's really, I think we find ourselves probably in more of a situational ethics. Many companies, the way you look at business I tell a lot of people, look at the ethics code of ethics or conduct for your company or your business, and then compare that with the code of ethics or conduct for your profession. And you might immediately identify that there might be some conflict. The primary one we find is production versus safety. Acceptable risk. How safe is safe enough? And so, as we're advising management, we're really calculating what is just for the company and what is just for the worker and what's feasible and what's right and what's acceptable, and kind of presenting that information to the decision makers so that they can make an informed decision based on hazard, risk, and then where the law stops, which we have a lot of standards and regulations. Most laws are ethical. However, there may be cases where following a certain law in a certain way may not be as ethical as we'd like it to be, or there may be a conflict there. Do no harm. Well, do I hurt greater good? Do I hurt 10 people or 100 people? Which would be a greater good type argument. But these are all different things that you'll find within, real philosophical ethics debates, different schools of thoughts. And when you have those thoughts that are in conflict with each other, that's when you have an ethical dilemma. And really, the right versus wrong isn't that interesting for the most part. Good versus evil. Most rational people would view some of those real extremes as quite simple to place a judgment on. But then you get into some of the other nuances of it. What the ethics of consequence, to where it doesn't, this is the saying of the road to hell is paved by good intentions. So in other words, the people's intentions really aren't weighed in the factor. It's all about the consequence. The consequence was we had an injury. The consequence was we had a failure. That's the consequence. And all the things that led up to that are irrelevant. The other idea, more Kantian type ethics, is more of the ethics of intent. And so the consequences are what they are, but what is their moral value, or was the intent of those actions noble or within good faith, or within fair judgment as a professional, so to speak, within the best of our abilities. And so you get into these bigger, larger metaphysics, type arguments, meaning of life, and are we nihilists? Does ethics really matter? Is everybody just self motivated for their own means at all times? One theory that I got with professional ethics, and I think it's kind of an interesting idea and very simple, is ethics for professionals. They're really anywhere, but professional ethics is simply what your peers will let you get away with.
Mm.
And so as long as your people let you get away with it, you could argue ethics one way or the other, right? It's so what really gets, I think, more of a struggle is when we start weighing right versus right, the greater of two goods, or lesser of two evils, wrong versus wrong. And sometimes we're in those situations, and those actually can be some of the more challenging situations because there might be real unknown consequences. When we put interventions in, we try to predict and try to think through all the change process of what the good and the bad consequences are. And we may not always get it right. Does that mean we're not ethical? Well, ethics, back to morals and ethics. Morals are how people believe the value of the world is, in a way. Ethics is simply the study of that. And so ethics is simply the study of morals and why people do what they do. Why decisions are made the way they're made. And it's really the study of action. So ethics is simply the study of action, and which then de facto is the study of morals, in a way, of why people did what they did. And so you could make the argument of stealing is wrong. Okay, well, you could also make the argument that starving is wrong. So if somebody steals bread to feed, is that unethical? If somebody steals the bread to sell it and make a profit, is that unethical? I think people could weigh those ideas of intent and consequences. Either way, the bread was stolen, but why was the bread stolen? And so that gets into a little bit deeper unveiling. If we look at decision of error in our human error models, human factors, and try to really get away from the blame game of blaming workers. We trained you, we gave you the equipment, we got procedures, it's your fault. Instead of looking more deeply into more of a systems approach and a human performance type idea, is why did they make that decision? How did the system set up in that? And I think it helps us ethic wise navigate that real gray 50 shades of gray of ethics, if you will, navigate that acceptable level of risk of when is it enough? Is it not enough? And those are judgment calls. So when the law stops, when there isn't really a standard or a law that really dictates a certain thing in safety work, now we start looking at ethics. Where really can we best serve as a moral agent to protect the worker, prevent harm, prevent injury, and or minimize costs, or mitigate, or minimize the risk, or minimize the severity of the risk. All the things we do in our professional practice, but there's ethics weaved into all those decisions. I just don't think we always recognize it as such, and many times we do well. But I think to your point, you said, I don't know that I've always what's ethical or not. I think we could all look back in our careers and our lives and reflect and say, yeah, here was something I did that I may not be proud of. Here's something that I did that I might have been do differently now. Maybe it's because I'm older. Maybe it's I'm more wise. Then you get into the idea of knowledge versus wisdom. Just because you have knowledge, does that make you wise? And so there's a lot of things that come from this idea of how do you explore self-reflection of ethics and decision making. And I think I've got a manuscript I'm working on now, a white paper that I've sent out for a few people that has some decision making models and kind of shows the differences between these moral positions. And you can kind of say which moral position would maybe apply to this context, or this argument of how we might influence decision or make a decision ourselves. So I think and I think the more people practice that, I've been playing around with this ethics a little bit for ever since they asked me to write an ethics chapter in a textbook. I wrote it 10 years ago, and ever since then it's been this kind of passive in a way, but a passive awareness of how do you integrate ethics into your thought, into your conversations. And then if you see things that are in a situation that's very has a lot of conflict or dilemma, how do you engage in those conversations? How do you engage with conversations of corporations that may make decisions, business decisions, that one of the consequences is it actually degrades safety, or puts it at higher risk, or introduces hazards that we're not prepared to deal with effectively. These are all things to where there's no law that says they can't, but when we look at how we might be an effective change agent, or an advisor to a leadership team or decision maker, how might we engage in some of these fairness and just and other alternatives that kind of play maybe a better picture, and maybe not. Maybe it is a business decision to where it's the only thing we can do, and then we're back to playing a little bit of defense and seeing how we can come up with the best possible safety context for whatever situation that it's in. But if you're in this business long enough, you will come across ethical dilemmas, whether that's discrimination, whether it's looking at disparities between rule following. You look at disparities and maybe how discipline is delved out. Then you look at the idea of the silent. Somebody told me one time that culture, the culture, there's a lot of ethics in it. The culture is kind of that invisible hand. What do you do when nobody's looking, or what's really the way we do things around here? And a lot of times what you find is they're doing things that they think are expected, and all of a sudden a mishap occurs, and then they almost get double jeopardy to say, well, you're not supposed to do that, it's not in the procedure. Well, yeah, but this is basically silence is consent. You guys wanted this out, and this is how we've been doing it for a long time, so why are you coming back saying, oh, the rule was, it's your fault now? So I think some of those types of things, to stand up and really look at organizations and the decisions we make and stand by them and say, hey, we made a decision. It may not have been the best, or we made a decision that we can all share in and feel pretty good about the involvement, that everybody's fairly happy with the outcome. And we kind of diverted maybe some problems that we wouldn't have had if we had involved some people in that discussion or decision making, because it does impact their own safety. So I think that we are an ethical agent, a moral agent, and I just think we can do a better job, maybe as a profession, moving that a little forward in thought. And there's very little research. We're working on maybe conducting some research, but there are some common threads in the research that exists, and then also some common threads that you find in the code of conduct and ethics. Primarily conflict of interest. When would it be a conflict to where my opinion could be considered purchased? For example,
Mm,
I took the money, so therefore, it's kind of like when you do expert witness work. They always try to tell you, you're getting paid for your testimony. No, I'm getting paid for my time. Those are two different things.
right, right,
And
right.
so, and so,
Mhm.
um, how do we, how do we do that? And then taking on assignments that you're not competent to do, and then really deciding, am I competent to do that? And how do I judge? How do I evaluate that? Um, Another one would be misrepresenting credentials. I've run into that a lot where people say they're a CSP or a CIH and they are not. And so validating that people who say they have credentials actually have them. Um, and then there's competency is a big one, keeping up to speed with the profession, not taking on tasks you're not supposed to be doing or really shouldn't be doing. um, can you versus should you, maybe in some situations like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then confidentiality is another big one. How do we ensure that any sensitive information on a worker, especially with their health, remains confidential, or deposition or testimony or interview information or things that might create problems. It's kind of like going out on the floor and telling the supervisor they're all running with scissors, and they ask who was it. It's like all of them.
Right,
I'm not
exactly.
going to tell you, why would I tell you David Ayers or whatever? I know what that's going to be. So,
Right, right.
just some of those subtle things of protecting people, because that way the issue doesn't get diverted
Right.
from the situation. So even accident investigations, where we really eliminate maybe even the gender from it, and look at it as worker as a very neutral thing, no names at all because it doesn't matter. And that way it just kind of takes away from any bias that we might have. And I think part of ethics exploration is really, we're doing research called epoch your bias, and really state your bias and understand where you're coming from, and where can that bias influence your work. And so those things have a play in it. Not making false statements, falsification of data is the big F word. So if I manipulate reports, or if I lie, cheat, steal on that kind of stuff, or mislead the public or mislead the management team. And then you look at pressures for numbers, and cooking the books, or is that really recordable, or is that really how many days were they really off, because those numbers matter for our next bid as a contractor for construction, and there's immense pressure for that, to ensure that they're able to make the bid. And sometimes that playing field is not very level, and sometimes the goalposts move. And so all those business realities that kind of pressure and put us into conflict of, is this really recordable? Is it not? Is it work related or not? Is it, does it really count on our books or not? Are we reactive? If we come out and say zero injuries and we've never experienced that, not even close, is that malpractice? By not being, misleading in really what's our ability for an injury rate. Um, so, those are all things that also come into what we should or shouldn't do, which is conduct. And then the ethics gets more into how we should live in a broader sense, treat everybody equally. It doesn't matter what your personal views are on the job as a safety professional. You look at every human and every individual and the environment and the public and all that equally in how we apply our trade craft. And so those are things that, plagiarism is another one that comes up a lot in work, to where I think our industry needs to do better with recognizing the sources of our information and where we get our inspiration. And I think it's actually makes you look better when you cite other work from other
Mhm,
professionals or other
mhm.
researchers. And I think it just adds credibility to what you're saying. But you don't have to be on the speaker circuit very long to find people that, they've basically borrowed without any kind of attribution other people's ideas and try to make them as their own.
Oh
And
yeah,
that
yeah.
in my mind is plagiarism.
Hmm.
But then even human ethics of subjects, showing people in graphic videos or showing their faces of somebody getting hurt, or some of these viral videos of, and then ridiculing them, shame. look at that idiot, or a bunch of Darwin Award winners, and and all this kind of stuff that plays into that. We can also ask ourselves, should we be showing a person being electrocuted in a training session? What good is that? What learning objective is that matching? How are we ensuring that the people won't be psychologically injured by that video because perhaps they had a relative or somebody like that that actually had an issue like that? So those are all things that I think we could do better in our safety work to maybe do better of protecting human subjects' identities, their things, and then also, really weighing in ethics and decisions and what's just and right and what's fair and what can be capable of.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think the one thing that we do is as a pretty good job as a profession is sitting down, assessing risk, knowing that money and time is not an endless endeavor, and saying, all right, so
Yeah,
how do I get the most bang for the buck here? Because in a ideal world, I'd have a lot of time and a lot of money, and I would just fix everything, but I know I can't, of course.
yeah,
So at some
yeah,
point, I have to say, this is what I will and what I won't work on. It doesn't mean it's not important. I just
yeah.
literally don't have the time and the money for everything, you know.
Well, and that's the reality of capacity. Just because you have the competence, you have the knowledge, skills, or ability to do something, you may not have the capacity to do it. And so, looking at that, and even in volunteer work, we sometimes overextend ourselves with volunteer work where our heart's there, but we just don't have the daylight,
I do it
and
all the time.
all the time. And so, when you think about that, the ethical thing to do, or maybe the good thing to do, would be to let the teammates that you're working with know that, hey, I overstepped my bandwidth, and I'm going to have to dial back because real work or life has now taken priority of this. And so being honest with where you're at capacity wise. And I think we take on too much as safety professionals because we have a lot of expectation. And I think that's a lot of pushback we need to do too ethically. Is it really fair for us to take full responsibility of every safety, every injury, all the things at a facility? I think not.
Right.
And that's a shared responsibility among everybody in the organization. It's not just the safety professionals. And so I think we need to do better about sharing that burden of mental thought of how safety is operated in an organization. And I've met a lot of people get burnt out because they take it so internally and they feel that pressure. And it's kind of like a plant manager that once asked, I was consulting with a group on the team, and he was really tearing everybody up over the injury numbers, and the rates were up, and the insurance and the EMR and all that stuff that was going to go along with the money, and basically telling the safety team they need to fix it. And my response, because I'm a consultant, so I get fired all the time. I'm not scared. Uh, but,
Right.
but but my response was basically, I said, "Oh, well, when do we sign the paperwork over to the safety team to be the owners of the company?" Because basically, you're asking for us to be held accountable for numbers we have no control over. We have no operational control over these numbers. We're not managing these people every day. We can't be everywhere at once. And so, if we're the sole liable party for these numbers, then okay, but how are we going to plan to fix it within our control, our newly found control, our new authority that you just granted us?
Right, right,
So
right.
I think that idea of not being fair, of thinking the safety person is going to solve the problems is a misperception a lot of companies have. So a lot of times when they're asking, hey, safety man, is this safe, back to acceptable risk and making decisions or judgments on that, a lot of times I'll push back to operations and say, I don't know, is it? And really try to enter that dialogue to say, let's what is safe, what is not safe, and really defining that in a way in an organization that really drives a culture. And I think transparency and trust, a lot of those things come from ethical behavior and the way that they approach safety from a person perspective and a realistic perspective of what safety is and what it means and risk and workplace hazards and all those things. And I think that to be real with it, and I think to your point, what do you do making those decisions? I think you made a comment earlier. What I might just add, I know our time's running short, but I think Aristotle had it. In what Aristotle said is, you don't have all the money to fix everything. You can't just do nothing. And so Aristotle had what was called the golden mean. In other words, what's
Ah,
that golden middle ground that is going to do the most good for the most number of people and to affect the best possible outcome. And it's not going to be perfect. And sometimes perfect is the enemy of good.
Oh
And
yeah.
maybe we need to take that compromise. And so, look at what's a healthy, reasonable compromise to where we can do justice by the company, because we have to be a faithful agent to the employer. That's
Mhm.
part of our job, is to be an agent of the employer. But then we're held by our ethics and codes of conduct to hold paramount safety and health of people, property, and the environment. And so, we have to reconcile that to say, okay, companies make money. We got to protect these people. How do we find, and that's where you get into prioritization of controls, and we look at hazards and rate them, and we do all of our trade craft that we talked about.
Mhm.
And from that science, that safety science, we look at how do we influence, and how do we influence an informed decision about safety and risk. And we have legal things, and then we also look at, well, what's right, at this particular time. So that's kind of, I guess, in a nutshell, of the golden mean, and looking at how do we weigh those things to make the best possible outcome. And sometimes it takes, reflection on that, and we don't always hit it, and we're not always right.
Yep.
And I tell everybody, I said, just because I talk about ethics, people that know me, they go, "Are you kidding?" What? That's like, everybody has to deal with ethics, and we've not all been right. So I'm not coming here as a holier than thou. I've made my mistakes in the profession, and I can think back on them. And the more I think about and study ethics, the more those things become more clear to me, of where I might have zigged instead of zagged, or when I might have made a more forceful decision or a less forceful decision, or where I might not have had all the facts, or might have been too rash to judgment. And then some things that I felt I did right, that I feel pretty good that I did as a young professional at 28, 29, that now in my mid 50s, I'm like, I'm pretty proud of that. I was pretty
Mhm.
stand up for a young professional to think through that way. So I think it is an internal journey, but at the end, we're judged and evaluated by our peers. And that's really what professional ethics is.
Yeah, yes, exactly. I really like what you're saying, but we are bumping up on time. Could you tell the audience where they can go ahead and catch you and find you? And then I'm hoping to have you back for part two, part three, and part four, as long as this was a positive experience for you, ethically too, at the same time
Hey,
then. You
anytime
know,
you give me a
uh,
microphone and allow me to talk about ethics, because nobody wants to talk about ethics. So I mean, I've
well,
got to do
I
it for
do.
free. you know. But I think it allows and it adds to get the word out and to get people thinking about it a little bit. But
Mhm,
you can find me at safetymentor.com.
mhm.
And you can just send an email there, an information request, and get to me that way. My email is expert@safetymentor.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm not too hard to find. Just search Daniel Snyder and safety, and that way you don't get the football owner or the opera singer. And and you'll find me on LinkedIn. I didn't put those things up on the board, but I'm fairly easy to find, and reach out to me. And if anybody's interested in that ethics project of the manuscript that I'm working on, and here's this broadcast, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to get it to you.
Awesome, Dan. Thank you so much. And
All right.
with that, episode number 173 with Dan Snyder is complete. Thank you, Dan. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.
You too.